Hello, and welcome back to It's a Very Exciting Time, a podcast by a UFO nerd and his tolerant friend. My name is Scott, and I've been fascinated by the phenomenon my whole life.
And I'm Chuck. I'm an aerospace nerd and a tolerant friend.
We started this podcast because since 2017, there have been shocking revelations, from news of secret Pentagon programs to confirmed videos of astonishing craft. In a nutshell, now that we know the government has recovered non-human technology.
Or at least we will, once we finish reading Lue's book.
It raises a natural question. My cats are going crazy in the background. I don't know if you've seen it at all. They're just zipping back and forth.
A little bit, yeah. It's great. Yeah. Keep going.
Anyway, it raises a natural question. If UFOs are real, what else? Suddenly, some of these other parts of the phenomenon that seemed unlikely are pulled into the realm of the possible.
And they may still be unlikely. But even if it's new science and not aliens,
it's a very exciting time.
And just the standard reminder, you can find show notes and more at veryexcitingtime.com. Support us by going to patreon.com/veryexcitingtime, where you can find extra content, Q&A videos, Discord address, etc.
All right. Chuck, we're doing a little bit of a weird episode today.
And I didn't read the notes, so I've got no idea what's happening today.
That is totally fine. Normally I give Chuck a little bit of a hard time if he doesn't read the notes, because I tend to write reactions for him, and then I'm like, well, I hope you like what I wrote. But today,
generally you nail it. So
today I don't really have a tightly prepared set of notes. We've discussed, Lue Elizondo's book, Imminent, dropped on Tuesday. We're recording today on Saturday. I read the book in 3 days, which is the fastest I have crammed a book since college. And let me tell you, my brain was melting and coming out of my ears. I'm not built for taking in information this fast.
Do you think you absorbed it properly?
Well, it's funny you asked that. So I was talking to the Discord people and mentioning I'm reading the book, I'm working on my notes. And someone asked, do you think there's enough material for a series of episodes? And I was like, no, not at all. It was a good book, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't anything we haven't heard before. And then last night I sat down to start pulling some notes together, figuring we'd do one episode on kind of everything that was in the book. While I was reading the book, I was reading on Kindle, I made liberal use of the highlighting feature so that I could look at my notes and see anything I might possibly want to reference in the show.
Sure. Yeah.
Chuck, I probably highlighted a quarter of the book. And it's not a thin book.
Yeah. Is this because of poor highlighter discipline, or which is my problem, or was it just that dense?
It was that dense. Now, I will admit, not every one of those highlights was a quote I want to read verbatim. A lot of them are. Some of them are oh, this is important context I should remember when we talk about this topic. Or some of them are hey, here's a whole block that kind of covers a section of time that I'll probably compress down to 1 or 2 sentences, but I'll want to remember where this is. Okay. But even so, the impression I got, because I crammed it so fast, was I personally, as someone who is deeply invested in this topic, did not get a ton of new information out of this. A lot of this is stuff we have, in fact, heard Lue Elizondo say before, but it's all nicely packaged, put together with a big bow on it. And I realized as I was putting it together, some of these things we have talked about, but we talked about 2 years ago when we started the show and had single-digit followers. And I don't know, maybe all of our listeners are hyper dedicated and they've all gone back and listened to every single episode we've ever recorded. And if that's you, hey man, thank you. That's great. But I expect most people aren't like that. They join a podcast with a backlog and they just start listening from there. And I try to make sure that we're not always doing the thing like, see our earlier episode on topic X. Like if we're talking about something, I try to make sure we're giving enough context for it to be understood there. So Lue talks about a lot of stuff that we have heard before. He gets a little more into the details. Broad strokes, he confirms David Grusch's narrative about a illegally concealed crash retrieval and reverse engineering program. But he also gets into some like wonky stuff, like he talks about his firsthand experience with UFOs. He talks about crash retrievals and alien bodies in the possession of the U.S. military. He talks about alien implants.
Oh, right. Yeah.
That's a whole...
I saw that in Discord.
Is
that's
genuinely new. Yeah. Now, that's not new in the community, but it's new from any of these kind of like core nuts and bolts characters like Lue and Chris, who have barely touched the idea of who is piloting these craft. They've been very focused on the craft. And then the bulk of the book, obviously... Sorry, go ahead.
This all started with the question of, will there be multiple episodes? It's starting to sound like there's definitely enough in here.
Yeah, I think there is. And that's why I was feeling kind of silly, is because I think partly because I churned through the book so quickly, I was left with kind of a high level impression. It wasn't until I sat down and looked at my notes and realized, like, Jesus, any effort to try to condense this into a 1-ish hour narrative is just going to fail miserably. I'm going to have to cut so much stuff. And I'll tell you the thing.
Congratulations, Discord. You were right.
The part that made me realize that we're definitely going to have to record multiple episodes is, obviously this book is presented as a memoir of Lue's time within the secret Pentagon UFO program. So there is backstory about Lue, his time with Project Stargate, how that led to him joining AAWSAP, how eventually AAWSAP became AATIP and Lue became the director, how Lue eventually left AATIP and went out into the world and joined To the Stars Academy, how To the Stars Academy imploded and Lue and Chris Mellon ended up working hand in hand with Congress to draft legislation. That stuff felt like it wasn't news because, frankly, we've lived it. Like, in the time we've been recording the show, we've been talking about all of this on virtually a daily basis. So it didn't feel like news, but of course it is news. And I kept going back and forth on, is this too inside baseball or not? And what it reminded me of, Chuck, back when you and I worked together at a company called Metal Toad, we had a boss who was trying to encourage me to do more public speaking. And at the time, HTML5 had just come out. That's how old I am, everybody who's listening. And I was going to give a presentation on HTML5. And being a big nerd, I had a bunch of slides in there about how HTML5 came about because of the failure of the W3C pushing XHTML as like a stricter version of HTML, and how the browser manufacturers wanted nothing to do with it. And they started up a competing group standards body and made this thing. And like, I was fascinated by this stuff. And our boss sat me down. He's like, Scott, no one cares about this shit. He didn't use the words inside baseball, but that's what he meant. It was like, this is way too in the weeds. People are here to hear about the HTML5 stuff. Talk about the new, attributes of the new elements. That's the stuff people are excited about. I was like, okay. And I was really annoyed at the time because I loved that stuff.
Yeah.
But he was right about the target audience and what should have gone in the presentation. So anyway, I had a similar feeling here, like, oh, wow, I could do a whole episode on how Lue became the director of AATIP and how he left and how Lue and Chris are responsible for all the legislation. But is it too inside baseball? And I finally
I don't know.
realized, no, it's not. First of all, if anybody out there is not interested in that, I apologize. We're definitely going to do that episode. But also, I was falling into the trap of thinking about all the things we've talked about over the last 2 years of this podcast and forgetting that the vast majority of our audience has joined us fairly recently and probably didn't listen to those episodes and may not be as intimately familiar with who's who and what's happened where. So anyway, we've got multiple episodes coming up. At the very least, we'll have this Inside Baseball episode. We'll probably have an episode specifically on crash retrieval and reverse engineering. Basically, kind of how Lue is echoing David Grusch's allegations and what Lue says that supports them and where Lue goes further. We may do an entire episode on one of the weirdest parts of the book, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, which is where Hal Puthoff basically figured out how UFOs work.
What? Okay.
Yeah, there's some wild shit in this book. So anyway, I don't particularly know how many episodes we're going to get out of this. At least 2, maybe up to 4. Who knows? It'll depend on how much people like it. It'll depend on how interested I still am, because we do these episodes every 2 weeks. So, how am I going to feel 2 months from now? Maybe something big and exciting will happen in the UFO world and we'll drop the book and move on. But that brings us back to today. Right? Like, what are we actually talking about today? So the reason the notes are not as tight as usual is we're doing a more kind of loosey-goosey freeform episode today. I've got a small list of kind of high-level takeaways from the book. There's about 10 of them that are kind of like, if I was telling someone what's in the book, these are the things I want to mention. And Chuck hasn't looked at them yet, but he's going to ask me about these topics. And then I will give you an off-the-cuff summary of it. I am not referencing notes. I don't have a ton of like quotes here. That'll all come in the more detailed episodes. But what I want to do today is kind of a high-level overview of what's in the book.
Okay, so at the end of each of these sections, you're expecting that that I have something intelligent to say, correct?
No, sorry. That's unfair to put on you. I meant you were going to read the topic line at the top. Like, Scott, I heard Lue was recruited into AAWSAP because, and then I'll go talk about it.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, are you ready for me to start talking about the book that I didn't read?
I'm sorry, man. I couldn't think of a better structure here. This definitely falls under a hashtag Let Chuck Talk episode. Like, normally I try really hard to put in good points where you can talk intelligently about it and react. And I don't really know a good way to do that when I am effectively delivering you a book report.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's fine. I've inserted some sections for me to respond, and I'm happy to read the first parts. So, all right. Topic 1. I hear that Lue was recruited into AAWSAP because he was part of Project Stargate. Can you tell me about that?
So 2 episodes ago, we did an episode on remote viewing and Project Stargate, which was the Pentagon's secret super spy program where they hired powerful psychics to do intel community work. And
I still can't think of this outside of SG-1. Like,
it's so weird.
I hear Stargate. Anyway.
Well, and I don't know, did the program come before the show? Was the show named? Did someone find out there was a Pentagon program? I don't know. Anyway.
We should find out.
So we knew beforehand that Lue had a background as a remote viewer. We didn't really know what that meant. Nobody had really talked about it. Lue, to his credit, did not want to talk about it. He's out there trying to get people to talk about nuts and bolts stuff and craft, and rightly perceived that disclosing that he was a trained remote viewer for the Pentagon might distract from his real point. I don't blame him for not doing it, but he does talk about it in the book.
Did he got the training? Did he talk in the book about his experiences remote viewing?
It's really interesting. So basically, he's in his 20s. He has been operating as a counterterrorism kind of guy. And he's approached by this dude who he describes as like the recruiter for all the weird projects. And he interviews Lue and he asks him if he knows anything about remote viewing. Lue says no. He proceeds to do some training. Now, Lue is very nondescript about what this training looks like. He doesn't talk about where it is, when it is, how long it was he doing it with anybody? Was it just him and this dude in a hotel room somewhere? Did he go to the Pentagon? Like, it's very unclear. But basically, he receives all of the remote viewing training, and he talks about all the same stuff we talked about 2 episodes ago.
Yeah.
He literally describes his trainer coming to him, like holding up an envelope and saying, describe to me what's in the envelope. He talks about his trainer coming to him with a set of coordinates saying, tell me what's at these coordinates, without having any idea what the coordinates correspond to. Things like that. And basically he describes the training was successful. He started getting good at this, and he was looking forward to joining the like cadre of operators who have this training when he receives word that the program has been shut down. So as far as I could tell, Lue was in Project Stargate in the sense that he received the Project Stargate training, but he never actually operated within the program. He just finished the training. Jeez, my cats are jumping on the desk.
Hello, cat.
Yeah. So yeah, it's really interesting. The main thing he describes, there's 2 takeaways that I thought were really interesting. One is he says his takeaway is the talent is not rare. The training is. He says most people have this ability to a greater or lesser extent and could be trained up, but most people don't have access to the training.
Interesting.
The other thing he says is he used it in field operations. Now, this was not him being tasked as a remote viewer, but he's saying he's operating as a field person out in, Afghanistan or something, and he'll get intel, and he would sit down and use his remote viewing to kind of check the thing out. And he literally describes one time turning down a mission. He's like, no, I've got a bad feeling about this one. And he doesn't go. And then the team that they sent in his place encountered an IED. Now, if you're inclined to not believe any of this stuff, obviously there's nothing saying this isn't a coincidence, but Lue's narrative through and through is very clear. Project Stargate was effective. The people they trained were able to do it. And the program was shut down because of religious fundamentalism fears. Straight up, people said, you're doing the devil's work, and they shut it down because they were afraid of it, not because it was ineffective. Now, that doesn't quite match what we found in our remote viewing research, but this gets back to where were we hearing that the program was shut down because it was ineffective? We were hearing about that from the Pentagon. So, I don't know, man. Make of this what you will.
Yeah. Okay. I like the idea that that the talent isn't rare, but the training is.
Right?
I think all of us have that instance where our intuition says, "Ooh, this feels icky," and you later find out that it was in fact icky.
And you get that a lot when you look into any psychic stuff. Like the idea is that humans are latently psychic, but it is not something that we are particularly skilled at. It's not something we use on a daily basis, but there are little moments. Like you've had a moment where you felt like someone was looking at you and you look up and they were. There's nothing in traditional science to explain how you could perceive someone who isn't in your eye line is looking at you, but you just kind of know sometimes, or you have a feeling someone's talking about you, or you think about someone a minute before they call you, just those weird little synchronicities. So there's definitely some evidence that this is like a latent human thing that can come out with training. And some people are just very good at it. Now, I didn't want to bring this up, but I'm going to real briefly mention this. We've talked a lot about Gary Nolan. Lue intersects with Gary Nolan in the book because they hire Gary Nolan to do some research into MRI scans on people who have had UAP encounters. And
yeah, the audience who Gary Nolan is.
Gary Nolan is he's an immunologist at Stanford. I think that's right.
Sounds right. Yeah.
Anyway,
but
apologies if I got that wrong.
He's a well-regarded doctor, physician.
Extremely well regarded. Yeah. So he was hired to look at a bunch of MRIs for people who had UAP encounters and lingering biological effects.
Okay.
And Gary has talked about this before. Basically, they discovered that a section of the brain called the caudate putamen was enlarged in these people. And Gary has proposed further research into this. And he's like, you can't really get funding for UAP research, but what you can do is do multiple controlled studies. So you have a control group and you have another group who you are actually investigating. And also you have a third group, which is this data set you've been given by the Pentagon that you're not saying it's UAP, but that's why the Pentagon gave it to you. And they looked into people with autism and people who had interacted with UAPs all had enlarged caudate putamens compared to the baseline samples.
Interesting.
This stuff is well outside my field of knowledge. I don't really understand it, so we haven't talked about it a lot, but this is one of the things that Gary Nolan is known for. Lue, in the book, makes the connection that the people who were trained in remote viewing, who were good at it, also had enlarged caudate putamen, and they were able to determine that the people who were most likely to have UAP encounters, effects, psychic abilities, etc., were people with Cherokee blood, which is a wild connection to make. And he's like, basically everyone in AATIP turned out to have Cherokee blood at some level. And anyway, it's wild stuff. I don't know how much credit to give it, but really wild.
Like, was the title of that chapter, "Is Autism Caused by Aliens?" Like,
no, it wasn't. So this is one of my frustrations with the book. As I have heard, Lue wrote the book himself. This was not a case of Lue working with a ghostwriter. And to Lue's credit, he is a very good communicator. He is not a particularly good putting things together in a logical narrative kind of way. So if you were looking up one particular topic, it's scattered throughout the book because he has chosen to do it more chronologically based on when he encountered it rather than when things kind of group together naturally. So there's stuff about alien bodies kind of scattered around the book. There's stuff about, this biological effects kind of scattered throughout the book. And it makes it a little hard to read if you're looking for what are the big takeaways.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Should we move on to the next one?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so something about Lue seeing orbs in his house?
Yeah. So we've heard that Lue has firsthand experience with UAPs.
Okay.
And one of the things that you find out if you dig into this for a while is that one of the most common type of UAP is what they call an orb, just a free-floating ball of glowing energy. There does not appear to be a structure to it, but it moves around intelligently. Now, if you're a skeptic, you might try to think like, oh, it might be ball lightning or a trick of the light or something like that. But that doesn't describe the way these things move around. Now, one of the things Lue says is when he interviewed for the job at AAWSAP, the guy he was interviewing with warned him that, quote, these portfolios are sticky. And he actually says in the book, I didn't know what he meant by that. Portfolio is a word we use for the information that comes with the project. Sticky, maybe he meant controversial. In hindsight, I should have asked.
Yeah.
what he turns out to have meant by it is there's a term that is now in common use in the field called the hitchhiker effect, which we actually know about from
Okay.
Skinwalker Ranch. So
Hmm.
George Knapp and the guys from AAWSAP have written a couple of books about the Skinwalker research that Bob Bigelow and the Pentagon did. And one of the things they found was people who went to Skinwalker Ranch and experienced paranormal effects, those effects followed them home. And I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean, literally, they would
Yeah.
go home and weird things would start happening in their house. Poltergeist activities, weird noises, hauntings, dog men, like large bipedal humanoid sized dogs menacing your family. Your spouse and your children would see these things independently
Wow.
of you. Your neighbors, close friends of the family, like it behaved like an infection, which is a very strange thing. So, yeah, the hitchhiker effect. Lue said everybody in OSAP was seeing orbs, was having experiences, himself included. The orbs were seen repeatedly around the house by his wife, by his kids, by his neighbors. He jokes at one point about his neighbors seeing one and turning him like, "Is this one of the weird government programs you're working on, Lou?" And he's like, "Ha ha ha." His wife at one point literally asks him, "Did you bring home something from work that you weren't supposed to?" Yeah.
So
Now,
this is
he's
not
very
just like his eyes being open to a phenomena or being more observant. It like everyone
right.
is seeing it.
Exactly.
Interesting.
He's very clear. Lou takes the secrecy part of this extremely seriously. His wife had no idea what he was working on. She didn't know he was working on UFOs. His kids certainly didn't. And obviously his
Sure.
neighbors didn't.
His neighbor.
But they were all
Yeah.
still seeing. Now, he's
Yeah.
very clear
Interesting.
that these orbs were not menacing, harassing, threatening. There were no ill effects. He does note that their research showed that orbs come in a bunch of different colors, and the blue ones, for some reason, seem to be associated with ill effects. Things like radiation burns, menacing
Yeah.
behavior. The orbs he saw
And
were
what
never
was his?
he never felt the need to tell his family to avoid them, but like he kind of notes like that's where his head is at. What are these things? Are they alien? Are they surveillance? Is it a foreign government thing? He has no idea, but like it just kind of became a thing. Like, yeah, there's an orb floating down the hallway.
What color were his orbs? Does he say?
I think he said green and clear.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good.
Right?
Good for him, at least.
Very
It
strange. Now,
it kind of
there's no
it smells like
or conclusion.
yeah. So in Star Trek, you know, when people inevitably have a teleporter problem and get stuck in between realms or whatever, there's always that like they can have limited effects, and like they tend to hang out around the people who might be able to perceive the effect or something.
Right.
I just wonder if it's something like that where they're like, oh,
yeah,
okay,
maybe
Lou's been here. Now we gotta
aware of them. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Interesting. Okay.
Or conversely, they're around all of us all the time, and you don't become aware of them until you're exposed to someone who, like, there are so many questions.
Future flight gets turned on.
There are no answers. It's just
right.
like a chapter. It's an anecdote he shares. My experience with orbs. That's wild.
Do you know? Did he ever try like touching them or capturing them or?
He doesn't mention that, which is interesting. You would kind of think that he would try that, but he also is very 100%. Clear that everyone else on the program was seeing them, and some people were experiencing ill effects. So I get the impression that the vibe was just kind of leave them alone. But I don't know. That is a really good question that is not answered in the book.
Dude, I would immediately invite them to breakfast. Just be like, hey, you want some food? And like start befriending them until, I don't know. Yeah, I'd totally befriend them. Okay. So The next one says that Roswell was real and bodies were recovered. What's your take on that?
This is really interesting, not because it's news. We've been hearing
Mm-hmm.
controversial claims about Roswell and bodies being recovered at Roswell for years and years and years from many different people. What's interesting about it is when David Grusch came out after getting all of his statements cleared, someone asked him about Roswell, and he said point blank, "I'm not allowed to talk about Roswell."
Sure.
Lue apparently is.
That's
Now, as far as I could tell, Lue went through the same DOPSR approval process that David Grusch did. He submitted his book. One funny detail about the book is there are sections of it that are blacked out.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned that.
Did it to DOPSR. DOPSR came back and said, you can't say this stuff. And they do what they do for FOIA requests. They just literally took a black marker to parts of the manuscript. Now, you would expect that he would go in and rewrite it to leave out those references. No, he just left the censored parts intact, which kind of gives you like an empty hole. And you're like, why would they black this out? What about this? But anyway, apparently Roswell was not a problem. Now, it may be that Roswell is not a problem because he doesn't say, I know for a fact that Roswell happened. What he says is, while I was being briefed and onboarded into the team, I was told that Roswell was real. And he straight up says, someone said, well, this all dates back to Roswell. He says, wait, Roswell was real? The guy says, yes, Lou, Roswell was real. A craft was brought down and 4 non-human deceased bodies were recovered.
Wow.
So maybe we get away with it because he's presenting it as a quote from someone else. I don't know, man. And he does include some more information later in the book. Hal Puthoff theorizes that the Roswell UAP was brought down by EMP testing that they were doing nearby.
Interesting.
So we know that Roswell is kind of near all the missile ranges and everything they were doing out there. And apparently they were running tests on how to generate EMPs without having a nuclear weapon going off, which, you know, you can imagine how that'd be useful. And apparently it brought down a craft.
Yeah, it sounds like those devices, HPMs and HPMs and E-bombs weren't until a lot longer afterwards. Interesting, yeah. I don't know, maybe.
But yeah, so they don't get into any details on it, but they do just point blank say, Roswell was real, we brought down a UFO, and we recovered dead bodies.
Interesting. And now I want to know, like, did they target like the EMP for just the right moment, or was it a total accident? I don't know.
Puthoff makes it sound like, for Roswell at least, it was unintentional. But there have been rumors for years in the UFO world that the military learned how to bring down UAP. And if you believe that narrative, it kind of makes sense. Like, oh, we did it by accident once, and then we did it on purpose a bunch of times, you know?
Yeah. Great.
Another detail they share, which again is something that the community has known about for years, but it's always good to get one more source kind of confirming it.
Yeah.
All of the families in the area were explicitly threatened by the military to keep silent about the crash.
Okay. Like, are these families on base or nearby?
No, the military base was actually a ways away. Roswell was basically like a farming town at the time. So families who lived in the area who may have been exposed to the crash or the recovery of the crash were visited and threatened to keep their silence. And we have heard, to be clear, we have heard this for years, but we get a little bit of confirmation in the book.
Yeah, that feels very Men in Black. That's interesting. Okay, cool. I don't have any strong questions about that. It sounds like it was mostly just confirmation, right?
Yeah, and here's the thing. We've never done an episode on Roswell because Roswell is a mess. It is kind of the UFO case, like the prototypical one that if anybody's heard about UFOs, they've heard about Roswell, and there's so much there. And it's almost impossible to sort out fact from fiction, from legend, from cover up. The U.S. military has always denied that Roswell was a UFO, but they have changed their story on what it was something like 7 times since the 40s. So, like, it's a mess. We've never done an episode on Roswell. We probably never will. There is a case that came up in the book that we probably will do an episode on, which is Lue talks about when he was getting onboarded. He went to a dinner with a bunch of people from Brazil as part of his duties and was informed about the events in Colares, Brazil. Now, if you've watched their UFO show that they did on the History Channel back in 2018 era, they devoted a whole episode to this. It's a very well-known case in the community, but in a nutshell, Colares is really weird because unlike almost every other UFO story you will ever hear, Colares involves UFOs behaving in a hostile manner to humans. There are many, many confirmed reports of people sustaining injuries from encounters with UFOs, hostile behavior, threatening behavior. The military was called in and investigated it. There was a big cover up. It came out, a while ago.
Wow.
So
we should totally talk about that
interesting case. And the part of the reason I think it's interesting and the reason why people are kind of uncomfortable with it is almost every other UFO encounter on the record is, I wouldn't say benevolent, but is like neutral. They're not aggressive. And we've talked a lot about how the vibe of the Pentagon seems to be, look, we don't know what these things are. And admitting that would be super embarrassing. But also, they don't seem to pose any real threat. They've been coexisting with us, and other than a few close calls, they've never done anything. So why bother looking into it? All of that kind of goes out the window once you hear about Colares. And we've talked a lot about Lue's kind of threat narrative. It makes a little more sense in the book, finding out that this was one of the first things he learned, is that UFOs are real. And also they have attacked people. Not commonly, that's not the regular interaction, but it has happened. And if you are a guy whose entire career has been evaluating threats, you're not going to throw away that data point. So we'll probably do an episode on Colares at some point.
Okay. Sounds good. Okay. But tell me about alien implants.
So this is one of the few things that has been getting press. If you have seen anything about Lue being covered in the mainstream media, they're either repeating that he says that the military has recovered non-human bodies, or they're talking about the alien implants. I never would have guessed that he would talk about alien implants because Chris Mellon and Lue Elizondo, we've talked about this already, have been very message driven. Their message was, there are things flying around in our airspace. We don't know what they are. And bare minimum, we should be paying attention to them. It's a very straightforward message. And they have very carefully avoided anything that would muddy that message, including discussing who's flying them. They will dance right up to the point of admitting that they're non-human, but they will do zero speculation about who they are, why they're here. And that means, by definition, they're definitely not getting into abductee stuff.
Yeah,
and this is a
no kidding
thing in the community. Is the community likes to refer to themselves as experiencers rather than abductees. Gives them a little more power in the engagement. But the experiencer narratives are, to be blunt, weird. It's it is not as simple as, oh yeah, they're abducting humans to gather genetic materials. There are stories of that, but there's also weird stories of like, like picking your brain, sending messages about environmental catastrophes, weird breeding programs, taking people off planet. Like it does not appear to be one thing, and it's messy and incoherent to talk about it. And I understand why a nuts and bolts type person would avoid it. And one of the things really hard is some of the experiences come back and say, I saw them put something in my body. Or they wake up in the morning and they have evidence, like they have an incision and they can feel something in their skin, or they're just kind of aware of it. But there's very few cases of these things being successfully extracted. And we've heard wild stories, like when they are pulled out, they appear to have been grown in place out of human tissue so that they look normal. They migrate around the body in a way that makes zero freaking sense. That should leave a trail of destruction, but it doesn't. It doesn't trigger an immune response. There's so many questions about it. Lue has an extended section in the book talking about it. Now, Lue has a background in microbiology. So the way he talks about it is, there was a scientist on the team who was focused on health effects. And because of Lue's background in microbiology, he would pester this guy with questions. And he said one of the things he would bug him about most was alien implants, because he's like, this doesn't make any sense. And the guy's like, yeah, it doesn't. You're right. But Lue claims in the book to have held an extracted alien implant in his hand and to have talked to doctors who have pulled them out of U.S. military service members who have encountered UAPs. He describes them as being like microchips surrounded in living tissue. And he repeats again the claim that they are mobile. They will move around the body to resist extraction. And even once they are extracted, they will move around in the petri dish until they eventually run out of energy. And he's described like doctors they have worked with who are like, no, I'm out. I want nothing more to do with this. Like, it's a line too far. Now, unfortunately, like the orbs, there is no conclusion. There are no follow-up questions. He doesn't like really settle any question. Are they tracking devices? Are they monitoring things? Are they releasing chemicals? Like, what are they for? There's zero answers. He just point blank talks about alien implants. And that is a buck wild inclusion in this book that I was not expecting.
Yeah, seriously, for someone so like focused on the nuts and bolts, do you think he was trying to give it a little bit more? It sounds like previously it's been a total mess. And so is he trying to clean it up a little bit and help people see some of the things that they should be looking at within that mess?
I don't actually know. If I had to guess, I would guess that what Lue did was put literally everything he ever learned into a manuscript and turn it over to the DoD, expecting that they were going to black out about a third of it.
Sure, yeah.
And they didn't black this out. What does that mean? You know, as we've talked about before, DOPSR approval doesn't mean it's true. It means it's not a national secret.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Or one that nobody wants to acknowledge as a national secret.
Yeah, exactly.
Also interesting.
And so I think Lue probably put in the bits that he knew he could verify if someone were to ask him about it. He avoided speculation and just saw what would get through. And this got through.
Yeah, okay. Interesting.
But yeah, alien implants, man.
Super wild. Does he talk about what they do? No. Okay. We don't know.
No, because they don't know. Like they're very weird. It is not a human device. It's not something that it does not appear to be a natural growth of the body, even though it is surrounded in living tissue. But Yeah, super, super weird. I suspect we'll be hearing more about that.
Yeah. It's so interesting that that's one of the things that the news picked up. Of all the things, like,
Well, because
uh,
it's weird and new,
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, like I said, I suspect we probably have a follow-up episode here. Um, it may be the same episode, it may be different, but we've got at least a follow-up episode on the crash retrieval legacy program. And also probably a follow-up episode on alien bodies, alien implants, things like that, which are kind of like more evidence of who's in the craft than just the
yeah.
craft themselves. Maybe that's the same episode. I don't know.
Okay, well, we'll see. Speaking of craft, you mentioned earlier that Hal Puthoff had figured out how UFOs work. I want to know more about that.
Yeah, this is definitely going to be a follow-up episode. As an
Okay, all right.
aerospace nerd, you're going to have a lot of fun with this.
Yeah,
But he
totally.
basically tells the story about coming into a skiff one day, and Hal Puthoff is in there, like frantically scribbling a massive equation onto the board. And when he
Wait.
gets
Rewind. What's a skiff?
secure compartmented information facility, I believe, or secret
What's the
compartmented.
purpose?
It's basically a secure room where you can talk about classified information. It's like a Faraday cage.
Okay.
Literally, they're shipping containers usually. Sometimes
Okay.
they're custom built into a building, but often
Sure.
they are a separate, like, shipping container style room that's basically a conference room
That's so
that's
cool.
designed not to be heard.
Okay, so he gets in there. Hal's doing his equation.
Yeah, and I want you to picture, like, crazy Doc Brown style, like frantically scribbling an equation up on the board. And he said he finishes the equation, he looks out at everybody, and he goes down the list of the 5 observables. And he goes, hypervelocity, check. Low observability, check. Transmedium travel, check. And he just like goes through all of them and says this equation shows it's possible. He says point blank, this is no longer a theoretical challenge. It is now a technological challenge. It's not,
Interesting.
how does it work? It's how do you build it?
Yeah.
And in a nutshell, what he describes is being able to generate a warp bubble around you. Now, I don't 100% understand this. We're going to do a deeper dive later, but he says, imagine this warp bubble like a diving bell that has a different environment on the inside than the outside.
Okay.
This allows them to move faster than you would expect because they're literally not interacting with the environment. This allows them to move faster than the things around them because due to time dilation, they're moving at what seems like a normal speed to them, but we're moving in slow motion. This allows them to go into the water without making a splash because from their perspective, they're moving very slowly. Like, there's a whole thing here. I don't want to get too into it. I know it sounds crazy and weird. Just bear with me. But he gets into it in the book and he takes it a step further and explains how the shape of the warp bubble, which is spherical, determines the shape of the craft. He says, obviously, if you want to make the most use of this warp bubble, in a perfect world, you would build a spherical craft. But a spherical craft would be very impractical once you turned the field off. Well, what is a stable shape that works when the field is off? A saucer. So you perfectly use the circle in one dimension, but you don't use up all of it and it can still land. He also describes how, what if you had a larger craft? And he goes through common shapes of craft. We often see these cigar-shaped craft. Well, you would put a warp bubble at each end of the craft to cover the whole thing. If you had a triangle craft, you would put a warp bubble at each corner. A very big triangle craft, you put a fourth one in the middle. The giant boomerang craft that we saw in the Phoenix Lights have bubble, 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 bubble. So I'm not saying that it makes perfect sense, but we have heard similar claims from the community for years, including, I wish I had looked it up. There's a website out there where a guy has written down basically how UFOs work. And it's basically this theory. And what's really interesting in it is it describes how this explains why they glow brightly. And it has to do with the way that the warp field shifts the way that light comes through it. It effectively moves energy up or down the spectrum. So you're basically dealing with redshift.
Like Doppler.
Yeah, exactly. Like just from the craft sitting there, it is automatically shifting normal energy up into the visible spectrum. It also explains time dilation effects. Like as you get closer, you're moving into their bubble and time proceeds slower for you than the outside world. You come out like, it's been 5 minutes. You've lost 4 hours. Anyway, it's buck wild stuff. We're almost certainly going to do a whole episode about it. I'm not a rocket scientist. I don't know how this stuff works. Chuck is adjacent to rocket science. But warp bubble theory is a whole other ballgame.
No, but there's some stuff there. I did some research on the Alcubierre drive, and one of the challenges with it is that, you do get to a place, but you're still going the velocity you were beforehand. And that can be a real problem when you're in a different area, especially a different galaxy or a different system. They can be moving really, I don't know how you figure that out, but it's fascinating.
I don't remember what episode it was, but we were talking about someone who said they were sharing information from inside the program. And one of the things they shared was the energy output of one of these recovered craft was like the equivalent of the energy output of the United States in a calendar year. Hal Puthoff says in the book, he's like, basically what you need to do is warp space. And there's 2 ways to do that. And I forget what one of them was. It's like you have to have such, which we don't have. And the other way is exotic. A lot of energy, like an obscene amount of energy. But if you have an obscene amount of energy, you can absolutely warp space.
I believe it. The first one you were talking about, and that's how they do the Alcubierre drive, or that's the theory, was exotic materials that have negative mass, or that kind of thing. That's cool. Mass
would be a very exotic material. I have no idea what you're referring to, but that's what?
it would react the opposite to gravity. So you'd fall up, as well as many other things.
Very weird.
All right, cool. Well, so let's move on to. So Lue took over AATIP due to religious objections to Skinwalker Ranch investigations. What is that about?
Okay. So something that has been very unclear about, and Lue in fact complains about this in the book, is we first found out about AATIP in 2017 when Lue resigned and spoke to the New York Times. Lue was the director of a program called AATIP. In the article, they described a secret Pentagon program that involved something like $12 million of funding from Congress that did a bunch of paranormal investigations out on Skinwalker Ranch, as well as UAP investigations. The problem is that program is a different program called AAWSAP. Lue ran AATIP. These are different programs. The New York Times article makes no distinguishment between them. We then heard some pushback from people who were involved in AAWSAP saying AATIP wasn't a thing. That was just a nickname for AAWSAP. We heard that when Harry Reid tried to turn AAWSAP into a special access program so that it would have access to all this stuff, they used the proposed name AATIP for it. It's been a mess. Like nobody's really able to say, not to mention that the whole time the Pentagon has been denying that the program ever existed. And if it did, Lue Elizondo certainly didn't run it. And even if he did run it, it was unofficial and had no funding. Like the story has changed so many times. So Lue gets into it a bit more in the book. And this is the whole inside baseball story that I told you about. We'll
Okay.
probably do a whole episode on this. But the short version is Lue is recruited into a program called AAWSAP, which investigated UAPs. They investigated the Nimitz case. They went out
Okay.
and interviewed all those guys. So they were doing the military UAP side of it, but they were also doing what we would think of as paranormal investigations. Now, the lead scientist, Likatsky, was very clear. We don't know that it's distinct from UAP. At Skinwalker Ranch, they experience paranormal stuff. They also experience UAP. Is this stuff all related? We'll only know if we study it scientifically. So they spent a lot of time and money going out to Skinwalker Ranch and studying paranormal shit. And they wrote papers about it. Now, Lue gets way into the weeds, talking about basically a change in command of who AAWSAP is reporting to. And it went from their commanding officers being very receptive to them being extremely hostile to it. And point blank, the reason given was, this is demonic. Lue is told, you're working for people who are doing the devil's work. Likatsky comes under an extreme amount of pressure, and Lue paints a picture here. And I should actually put a little footnote here and be clear. There is a bit of controversy around this part, and the word on the street is that Likatsky is also preparing a book about his time at the Pentagon, and that perhaps he is unhappy with Lue's portrayal of events. So I'm just going to preface this by saying this is Lue's version of events, which may or may not be wholly accurate, but it does kind of explain some things. Lue says AAWSAP was coming under increasing pressure, and Likatsky was basically unwilling to water down the way that he talked to anyone about it. And he's using words like archangels and angels and demons and poltergeists. And, you know, they're talking to people in Congress who are like, why the F are we paying for this? No, this is nonsense. So Lue describes how they realized the only way that they were going to be able to keep the UAP part of it alive was to break it off into its own program called AATIP. AATIP was a nickname that AAWSAP went by. It is also the name of the program that Lue ran. There was, at one point, going to be funding for it. That funding was stolen due to hazy understanding and abstract descriptions of the program. In order to not give away what the program was about, they had to write it in a very vague way that allowed another program to swoop in and steal their funding. So Lue describes they're basically running this thing on a shoestring budget. It's him and like 3 other people out of his office. He had recently been promoted. He was able to give it cover and keep the whole thing nestled under his portfolio. But this is why the Pentagon could get away with saying there was no official program, because Lue, to keep it from getting squashed, was kind of keeping it secret. This is why the Pentagon can say there was no funding. There was no funding. This is why the Pentagon can say no one was officially assigned to AATIP, because they weren't.
So makes sense.
Yeah, basically, Skinwalker Ranch involved a bunch of paranormal research, which was arguably scientific and valid, but was rubbing people the wrong way. And under pressure to shut the whole thing down, Lue took it over and renamed it AATIP and ran it exclusively under his purview. He's now the director of AATIP, which is focused exclusively on looking at military encounters with UAP.
This, I have to say, this all makes sense to me. In actuality, like at first I wouldn't have believed it, but lately at work I feel like I've seen more of that kind of thing happening. Like some of my projects don't have a program manager. I still get paid just fine, and I still have some folks who don't actually report to me, but they do work on this project.
And
I can
Lue
totally
is
see that happening.
clearly writing this book from the perspective of a disgruntled insider who dedicated his career to the Pentagon, believes strongly in the mission, and went from being a very successful field ops kind of guy to a guy working in the Viper's nest and like constant backstabbing and politics and
Right.
frustration. But yeah, we'll talk about that more later. That's
It
the
sounds like
inside.
he got promoted to management.
He very much did.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Okay, so next section is AATIP developed a UFO trap.
Yeah. I'm surprised that this one hasn't been getting more headlines.
Yeah.
Lue describes there comes a point where they are getting increasingly U.S. military service members are encountering UAP, and there is no guidance in place for what to do about it. There is a severe amount of stigma. There's no official reporting mechanism. And what do we do? Is this a problem?
Right.
He describes how they would reach out to service members to get their statement on an event that had happened, and the service member would just straight up lie to them. I don't know what you're talking about. Nothing happened. He said Lukatsky got really good at reaching out to them and telling them what they wanted to hear. Listen, I work for a special access program. I can't tell you what it is, but it's ours. And it would really help us if you could tell us what you saw so we could refine what we're doing to help avoid it being spotted in the same way. And they would go, oh, thank God, this thing has been stressing me out so much. And now that I know it's ours, yeah, what I saw was X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, that's perfect.
So anyway, Lue describes how they're doing all this research, they're coming into it, and they discover two things. One, UFOs are drawn to nuclear stuff. And we've talked about this before. There's a whole book on the topic called UFOs and Nukes, which I highly recommend. But basically, anywhere the US military has nuclear stuff going on, there is a dramatically higher than baseline chance of UAP interactions. And the other thing that happens for whatever reason, is in the water. This is part of why the Navy encounters it, but like UFOs and water and UFOs and nukes are a thing. So they're like, okay, well, let's set up a trap. He calls it a honeypot. He says, let's put a nuclear powered carrier strike group out in the middle of the Atlantic. And he describes putting a big nuclear like beacon. And he doesn't describe what that is, but let's assume for the moment they put a shit ton of nuclear missiles on one of the carriers. Specifically for the purpose of summoning UAPs. They're like, this happens anyway. Let's take advantage of it. And we'll just pepper all of the ships around there with our top data collection intelligence gathering devices. And he's very clear in the book. He's like, I can't tell you what they are, but trust me, we were going to get some good data. They put together a plan for this, and Lue is thrilled. He's like, this is going to be great. We're going to finally investigate this safety risk. And they run it up the chain of command, and the Pentagon wanted nothing to do with it. They were like, this is weird. And none of our business. So this is kind of the start of Lue's disillusionment with the Pentagon. For reasons that we have discussed and will continue discussing, Lue is primed to see this through a lens of national safety and threats. And he's very clear to say, I don't necessarily mean they're hostile, but until we know they're not, it's stupid not to look at it. Like, as someone who is trained to evaluate threats to the United States, this is something that could be an existential threat. And the fact that we're not looking at it at all is criminally negligent. That's always been his take. And here he is like, hey, I'm the guy who's been investigating the UAP. I am hearing across the board these things are happening. Our service members are freaked out. We have no guidance. We have no information. Let's do this. And the Pentagon says, no, thanks.
I mean, the way this is presented, I don't know if this is what he meant, but I could absolutely imagine them saying like, no, we're not going to send out a carrier strike group for this random thing. If he had found a carrier strike group that already had all those assets and suggested adding some people there, maybe, but
right?
I don't know.
Well, and not to put too fine a point on it, but the two biggest cases that Lue and Chris Mellon lean on are the 2004 Nimitz Tic Tac encounter, which was, hey, guess what? The USS Nimitz was a nuclear powered carrier strike group.
Yep.
And the 2014 USS Roosevelt carrier strike group training exercise. Like, both of these were nuclear carrier strike groups out in the water encountering UAPs.
Makes sense. And I'm not saying he did it wrong. Like, I don't know. He's a smart cookie. I'm sure he did the best that he possibly could.
Yeah.
But it is a shame that we weren't able to get that to happen. That would have been very interesting.
Yeah.
So it sounds like you mentioned this, like the beginning of his frustration, and the next section is that that he left the Pentagon because he couldn't brief the SecDef. What is that about?
Yeah. So we actually knew about this already, but he gets way more into the details. And again, this is part of our Inside Baseball episode we'll do. But in a nutshell, as time goes on, Lue is becoming increasingly frustrated that no one is taking this potential threat seriously. And he has a number of things happen that lead to him needing either cover or permission from higher up the chain of command. His direct supervisors are extremely opposed to this stuff. There's a whole freaking thing here about his direct boss is actively opposed to Lue, and that guy later ended up, having a whole case against him because of sexual harassment and inappropriate behavior. And but the SecDef at the time, the Secretary of Defense, is James Mattis, a guy that Lue knows personally and has worked with in the field. He tells a few stories about working with Mattis. At one point, he tells a story about coming in and telling him they're out in Afghanistan somewhere. He says, there's going to be a rocket strike in 10 minutes. And Mattis turns around. He's like, I want all the helos in the air. I want people up. I want, starts yelling at everybody. He turns around and looks at Lue. He goes, hope you're right.
Yeah.
But he didn't die.
Yeah.
So Lue describes, if I could just sit with Mattis, I know he would want to hear this.
Yeah.
But Mattis is the new SecDef and is in a vulnerable position politically. And basically everyone between Lue and the SecDef want nothing to do with the fucking UFO guy, man. Get out of here. Right. And he describes trying to follow the chain of command, and he's talking to Mattis's front desk, and they're requesting briefing materials, and he's sending witnesses and throwing all of his data at them, and they just wouldn't do anything.
Yeah.
And he actually has a really interesting bit where he addresses the question that someone like you and I might wonder, why not just call him? Know him. Just hey, James, meet me downstairs for coffee. I've got something to tell you. And he's very clear. He's like, okay, listen, we're all civilians at the Pentagon now. We're all former military, but technically this is a civilian organization. But the chain of command is very much still in effect. And you can tell he's having difficulty even expressing how severe a mistake it would have been for him to go over the chain of command. He's like, it would be a sign of disrespect to the general himself for me to do that. So all of that is to say, Lue keeps coming back to this idea of, is it a threat? And he has a section in the book at one point where he says, look, there's three possibilities. They're benevolent, they're neutral, or they're malevolent. He's like, we have evidence to suggest they're not benevolent as much as some of the more hippy-dippy side of the UAP like to portray them as, our space brothers who are here to help us out. They don't seem to be taking any steps to help us. He has one thing that he mentions that I find a little hilarious. He's like, they didn't stop us from dropping the bomb. They didn't stop us from developing the bomb. They haven't stopped anybody else from making bombs and bombing shit. They don't seem to have any interest in stopping us from developing and using nuclear technology. They do seem to be extremely interested interested in what we're doing, but they don't seem to have any interest in intervening.
Right.
We also have signs that they are not neutral. And again, he leans heavily on Colaris. He leans heavily on reports about UFOs switching nuclear missiles on and off.
Right.
You know, like, so he never comes out and says, I think they're a threat. But what he makes a pretty compelling case is, as a guy who is trained to evaluate threats, he can't rule it out. And there is evidence to suggest they may be a threat. One of the things he says is the way that they behave looks like recon. If we were going to another country that we didn't know anything about the people there, how we would prepare to invade or interact with them would look a lot like what they're doing here. Autonomous drones, heavy data gathering, surveilling everything, limited interactions, limited engagements, getting a feel for it. He's like, I don't know that's what they're doing. I don't want to be alarmist. But again, he thinks it's dumb to stick our head in the sand and ignore it completely, because it's probably not that. He's like, we have no way to evaluate that, and it may be, and there's evidence to support it. So why the fuck aren't we looking into it? Why am I having so much trouble getting anyone to listen to me? And I think the straw that broke the camel's back is he found one of the defense contractors who has recovered material. He spoke to the defense contractor, and they said, yes, we have it. We can't give you access unless you get permission from the head of the Air Force. Well, the head of the Air Force is legendarily opposed to any UFO shit. Like, this was basically call our bluff. Well, he's higher than the head of the Air Force, the SecDef. So Lue kind of sets his sight on, I need to get the SecDef involved to approve this honeypot mission, to get us access to this defense contractor. Like, we have basically hit the limit of what our group is capable of doing without the air cover that someone like the SecDef could give us.
Right.
And he can't get access to him. He tries and he tries and he tries. And finally, he ends up resigning. Now, we already know this part from the 2017 article. We'll talk about it more in the Inside Baseball, but basically he resigns and he writes 2 resignation letters. One to his direct bosses, who are not read into the UAP program, so he cannot tell them about it. And one to Mattis personally, to the Secretary of Defense. Dear sir, it's been an honor serving with you. I am resigning out of frustration because no one will take this UAP issue seriously. It is a clear and present threat. I really hope you will see my resignation as a red flag that this needs investigation. And he puts that in an envelope, hands it to Mattis's front desk. It is addressed to the Secretary of Defense, James Mattis.
Yeah, awesome.
Now, after he leaves, he suffers a smear campaign because what he does after he leaves is he joins To the Stars and he starts talking publicly about it. A few things happened. One, all of his emails were deleted. Now, Lue says this was presented as kind of a routine data preservation thing. You know, some IT guy was like, oh, we don't need all these emails anymore, just purge them. Except Lue was involved in Guantanamo Bay. Now, I haven't talked about this yet because it is a vanishingly small part of the book. He mentions it in passing a number of times, mostly in reference to, I was now working on the Guantanamo portfolio and flying back and forth to Guantanamo. He does have one section where he talks about when there was political pressure to shut down Guantanamo Bay, people were blaming him for keeping it open. They were like, don't talk to me. Lue Elizondo is responsible for keeping Guantanamo Bay open. He's like, now, I did think we should keep it open, but the idea that a GS-15 civil servant could be responsible for keeping this thing open against the wishes of his superiors is insane. I don't know. Lue is clearly a patriot. He's clearly a guy who believes that what we did in Guantanamo Bay was not bad, which I have issues with.
Yeah.
Whatever. The point is, Lue is named in court in the 9/11 trials as the U.S. Czar of Torture, and there is a court preservation order on any material Lue Elizondo had because it may be relevant to the court case. And then they deleted all his emails anyway to avoid having to confirm that he was involved in UFOs. Now,
got it.
Lue kind of dances around this point, but I think it's worth talking about. Someone at the Pentagon looked at this and said, Lue's emails are going to do more damage to us on the UAP topic than they will serve us in the court case against 9/11. He says they were willing to sacrifice evidence in the 9/11 case to keep this from coming out into the public. It's hard to avoid reading it that way. Now, I don't know if he's right. Maybe it really was just an IT guy who fucked up and didn't know there was a court preservation order. Maybe the person who deleted it did do it for political reasons, but didn't know about the court order. I don't know.
Yeah.
But this is where we're getting into the messy part of the story. It is undeniable that after Lue left the Pentagon, he suffered a smear campaign. Every time Lue came up in public, the Pentagon acted out against him. They deleted his emails. They denied AATIP existed. They denied Lue worked for them. They denied that Lue ran the program. They admitted he ran the program, but the program had no budget and it was unofficial anyway. They attempted to remove his clearances to the point where he also had to file a complaint with the Inspector General. His resignation letter was not shared with the SecDef until almost a year later when the New York Times article was coming out. And he says he heard through the grapevine that this came up. Basically, James Mattis is at a dinner party and someone comes by and they're like, sir, you should know that Lue Elizondo's resignation letter is going to be leaked to the press tomorrow. He says, when did Lue resign?
Oh, no.
They kept it from him.
Wow.
So I don't know that everything Lue says is the result of a malicious government conspiracy. How much of it is just normal bureaucratic fuck-ups? How much of it is a single boss with an axe to grind? He makes it very clear that his direct superior was furious when he quit. Chuck, you and I have had bosses who got vindictive with us, and we don't do anything important. We're fucking web developers. Lue chalks this up to the influence of the legacy program.
Yeah.
I'm not 100% prepared to go with him on this. I believe that the legacy program exists. I believe that they are happy to set up barricades to prevent anyone from finding them. I don't think the legacy program actually gives a shit about Lue Elizondo. I think the institution is just kind of instinctively designed to circle the horses. Here's a guy who's an insider. He was an intelligence person, and he's now talking to the press. I don't care what he's talking to the press about. That's an enemy, right? I fully believe that would be the culture there. And the fact that he's talking about aliens is kind of irrelevant.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I can see that. And the whole removing clearances, I thought clearances got removed immediately after you stopped working for, like, it requires a sponsor.
So I don't actually 100% understand this. What I do know is it is incredibly common for people in the Pentagon to go work in private industry. And the threat to remove your clearances is effectively a threat to remove your ability to do work in the future. But you're also right that clearances do require a sponsor. We've heard that from David Grusch. I'm hazy on this. What I do know is this is something they talk about all the time, is this is a threat leveraged against whistleblowers. If you whistleblow, you will lose your ability to have any work with the government in the future because we will make sure you don't get clearances.
Yeah. Okay. I just did some quick Googling, and there's a difference between inactive and revoked. And that makes total sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, yeah, Lue basically he takes over AATIP because Skinwalker Ranch is controversial. Then it turns out even military UAP encounters are controversial, and even there he's still getting pushback from religious zealots telling him that this is all demons. He increasingly hits roadblock after roadblock after roadblock and cannot get the cover that he needs from his superiors. He cannot get access to the SecDef, so he resigns. Now, we'll talk about this more in the Inside Baseball, but in a nutshell, he resigns and is immediately offered a job at To the Stars Academy with Tom DeLonge. And there's a really funny encounter where he describes going home and telling his wife that he is resigning because he's pushing for UFO transparency. Remember, she doesn't know what he's been working on. This news to her. And he's taking a job with Blink-182. He says, do you remember Blink 182? And she's like, the band the kids like? Are you going to be a roadie? Like,
oh my God, right. Well, right? I mean, so midlife crisis, right?
Yeah, exactly. So he takes a job with To the Stars. And one thing that I appreciate he's clear about is this was not a smart decision. By resigning the Pentagon early, his I can't think of the word. Pension fund. His pension fund is locked out until he's 65, where normally you can start taking from it at like age 50 or something like that. So after much longer wait before you can access your pension fund. He's putting himself at risk, and any job he takes is going to be a severe pay cut. And he's very clear about that. Tom DeLonge says, yeah, we're going to offer you a job as our counterintelligence guy working at To the Stars. But you have to move to California. Ooh. And his salary was going to be a fraction of what he made at the Pentagon.
Really?
California ain't cheap. So he describes they got this house they're struggling to pay for. Almost immediately, the pandemic hits. To the Stars practically folds overnight, and his wife turns to, they have long since started renting out the house that they bought because they can't afford to live there and are living in an RV on someone's land.
Yeah.
His wife is like, do we have to stay here if you don't go to the office anymore? He's like, well, Tom told me we had to live in California. She's like, hon, our home is on wheels.
Yeah.
So they moved, elsewhere. And Tom eventually called him and told him that he no longer had a job at To the Stars. And he's a little aimless. And this is when he starts working with Chris Mellon. Here's the thing. We have talked before about how Chris Mellon and Lue Elizondo, in particular, among many others, have been actively campaigning Congress. The logical word to use here is lobbyist, but he actually quotes Chris at one point. He says, to be very clear, we are not lobbyists. Lobbyists expect something. We are here to inform Congress. We have information that they very badly want. They are not lobbyists. I think that's a bit of semantics, but I appreciate Chris knows how to play the game. But they basically shift full-time into working with Congress. Now, Lue also gets a job with the Space Force at some point in here. Yeah, so he's a contractor or an outside consultant or something for the Space Force. And he doesn't really talk about that other than to say, the Space Force is very interested in UAP.
I would hope so.
Right? You guys got one job.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Because I was going to ask, how is he making money if he's, if To the Stars fell apart during pandemic?
Now, here's the thing. Okay. I knew Lue and Chris were lobbying Congress and pushing for this. Lue does a very good job of portraying all of their interactions with Congress here. And again, we'll get into this in the Inside Baseball episode, but basically everything that Congress has done, Lue and Chris were directly involved in holding their hand and pointing it at them. They worked tirelessly to bring in eyewitnesses, to brief Congress, sending people in to verify this information, making sure Congress understood. And he said the message they got from Congress over and over again was, oh my God, like this is serious. What can I do to help? And he said,
Yeah.
well, if there was legislation that would force the Pentagon to be more transparent, that would be helpful. Here's what
Right.
we think would help. He said the first thing they pushed for was to have Congress ask the Pentagon for an unclassified UAP report.
Hmm.
Now, I thought about this because when it came out, all the rest of us could focus on is there's a classified addendum that we don't get to see.
Sure.
But Chris and Lue, to their mind, the unclassified part was the important one because this information was in the halls of Congress, but it was all classified. Nobody could talk about it publicly. Simply by virtue of forcing the Pentagon to publish an unclassified version, we're forcing the Pentagon to say, UFOs are real, and here's what we know about them. And no matter how much whitewashing they tried to put on it, no matter how much they tried to kind of boil it down and be like, yeah, but I mean, there's nothing really, literally by just coming out and saying there are 400 unidentified cases and the most common shape we see in orbit, yada, yada. That was a huge amount of progress.
Interesting. Yeah.
Every single thing they did from that point forward was basically in reaction or proactive, but it's a cat and mouse game between them and the Pentagon. The Pentagon hears that they're going to start pushing for an independent UAP office. So the Pentagon says, oh, no worries. We've proactively created this AOIMSG group who is going to have one guy and a budget of $10, and he's in a windowless office in the basement. But see, we've got a UFO office. No need for you to make one. And they came back and said, no, you have to make a UFO office. It has to have this budget. It has to report to these people. It has to do this. They held them to the wall. Then they made that office and they stole all the funding from it. It was very clear this was the legacy program fucking with us. They came in and stole the funding, so we had to come back and fight on the funding. They got nitpicky about language, so we had to come back and get incredibly specific about what does UAP mean, and specifically. There was a bit we talked about where early on they said, okay, you have to give us a report on all the UAP, and we have to create an office investigating UAP. And at any point, if you determine that something is man-made, it is not the responsibility of this office. Hand it off to someone else. This office's only job is to investigate the unidentified and non-man-made things.
Interesting.
Everything they did is in reaction to the Pentagon being like dragging their feet, like, oh, we're not going to do it. And all of that leads up to the UAP Disclosure Act, which is the latest salvo in this at, again, attempting to nail everything down. If you go read the UAP Disclosure Act, a huge amount of it is just defining what are technologies of unknown origin? What is non-human intelligence? What is a UAP? What is transmedium travel? Like pinning these things down so the Pentagon can't weasel their way out of talking about them. So I knew all of that, but I didn't really grok how much work they did into it. And there was one really delightful tidbit in this. So when I started getting really into this stuff back in the day was around the time that To the Stars worked with the History Channel to make a show about Lue's efforts to investigate UAP. It was a very well done show. He specifically says Senator Gillibrand and Representative Burchett both watched that show on History Channel and were on board with talking about it because of the show. So it's like this thing he did coming out of the Pentagon, just trying to get the word out. Yo, this stuff is real. Literally paid off. He's like, 7 years ago, I would not have guessed we would be where we are today. And every time I question, did I do the right thing in resigning? I look at the bills that we have gotten passed, the progress we have made, and I go, yes, absolutely, I did the right thing.
Yeah, I'm sure it's incredibly stressful, but sometimes you have to do that. Interesting.
Yeah, man.
Wow, it sounds like
book.
it sounds like a dense book, and I see that there's like 27 pages after this of other notes. So
my first attempt at notes. Yeah. These are unorganized, but yeah, I don't know, man. Those of you who are listening, if there's any part of this that you're like particularly interested, let us know. Comment on YouTube, send us email, Scott or Chuck at veryexcitingtime.com. If you're in the Discord, give us a shout there. I'm going to be picking topics for this. Yeah. Probably our next several episodes are going to be zeroing in on one particular part of the book and talking about it in more detail.
Right.
The only way I think we don't do that is if something more exciting happens, right. Obviously something more exciting would take focus from this, but yeah, man, there's a lot of information here. Like I said, at the very least, I think we will do that Inside Baseball episode, kind of the history of how Lue Elizondo came to run the Pentagon UFO program and how he came to leave it and lobby Congress.
Sounds good.
Probably do an episode that's less about the book and more about all the people who have come out to support David Grusch's claim, because kind of backing up to what Matthew Pine said, the effort from this point forward is about getting more and more people to confirm it, and there's a surprising number of people who have backed the basic claim of an illegally hidden crash retrieval and reverse engineering program. And we'll probably do an episode on the more weird side of it with, the recovered bodies, alien implants, the biological side of it. I don't know. Let us know if there's anything else that you'd love to see more information about this. I'm still laughing at me telling the Discord, like, no, this is only going to be one episode. And then I was immediately overwhelmed.
Yeah, I feel like our Discord has frequently been very right, and honestly, it's a delight to read all the stuff that they talk about. I learn a lot in there. So
yeah, the Discord's hopping. Yeah, if you're not in there, I encourage you to join. It's free.
Yeah. Did you put the link on the website? I know you were thinking about doing that.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Go to our website. Yeah. Well, should we do our outro then?
Yeah, I think we probably should. Yeah. Okay. Was there any questions or any final thoughts you had on this? I know it's a lot.
Oh God. I don't know. This is like one of our longest episodes ever, which is kind of wild. And I did not drink enough caffeine right beforehand, so I'm like running on empty. It sounds interesting, and I'm excited to dig into some more details.
Oh yeah, we have to do an episode on the warp bubble stuff. Yeah, I know Chuck will be excited for that.
Fun.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on It's a Very Exciting Time. You can find show notes and more on our website, veryexcitingtime.com, as well as links to our Discord and social media accounts.
And feel free to email us at Scott or Chuck at veryexcitingtime.com. And if you'd like to support the show, please check out our Patreon at patreon.com/veryexcitingtime.
And Chuck, as always, my wife thanks you for listening to me talk about UFOs so she doesn't have to.